How does a country with literally zero natural resources become one of the wealthiest on the entire planet in just 50 years? I know, it sounds completely impossible, but it's exactly what Singapore did. So let's get into how they pulled off one of the greatest national turnarounds in history.
To really get your head around this story, you have to understand where they started. In 1965, Singapore wasn't just a poor country. It was a tiny island with nothing that had just been kicked out of its own nation, Malaysia. Fast forward to today, and the average person in Singapore is actually richer than the average American. The difference is just staggering.
And this whole story starts not with a celebration, but with a crisis. You see, for most countries, Independence Day is a moment of victory. For Singapore, August 9, 1965, was a moment of absolute terror. They didn't ask for this. Independence was forced on them.
And you can see the emotion of that day right here. This is Singapore's founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, on national television. He wasn't giving a victory speech. He was openly weeping. He'd spent his whole life fighting for Singapore to be part of Malaysia. And in that moment, he truly believed his country was doomed.
And you can't blame him for thinking that. I mean, look at this list of problems. No natural resources, not even enough fresh water to drink. Unemployment was sky high. They were surrounded by neighbors who were not exactly friendly. They had no army to speak of. And on top of it all, deep racial tensions were simmering, ready to boil over. The odds of this country even surviving were basically zero. But facing these impossible odds, Lee Kuan Yew developed a very simple and very brutal philosophy. As he famously said, we either succeeded or we died. There was no plan B. There was no safety net. Failure wasn't just an option. It meant the complete end of Singapore.
This quote pretty much says it all, doesn't it? It perfectly captures his entire mindset. Anytime one of his advisors said a plan was impossible, whether it was finding water or building housing for everyone, his response was basically, well, then figure it out. That relentless, pragmatic attitude became the engine that drove everything.
So, what was the big plan? Lee Kuan Yew knew that Singapore had exactly one advantage: its location. It's a tiny island, but it sits right at the mouth of the most important shipping lane in the world. It's basically the toll booth on a global superhighway. His entire strategy was built around leveraging that single fact to its absolute limit.
And here's the thing. He didn't just tackle one problem at a time. He knew that wouldn't work. To survive, they had to solve everything at once. They had to transform their slums into modern skyscrapers, turn their unemployed population into a world-class workforce, and make their tiny nation strong.
You can think of the strategy as a kind of five-front war on their problems. They desperately needed water, so they started building reservoirs and investing in new technologies. They needed housing, so they launched one of the biggest public housing projects ever. And at the same time, they were focused on jobs, education, and defense, all at once.
Okay, the housing plan was absolutely brilliant. At the time, most people lived in crowded, filthy slums. The government went on a massive building spree, putting up huge apartment blocks. But here's the genius part. They didn't just rent them out. They created a mandatory savings system that made it possible for everyday citizens to actually buy their own homes. This gave everyone a literal financial stake in the success of the country.
And the results? Well, they speak for themselves. Today, around 80% of all Singaporeans live in public housing, and almost all of them own their homes. That is a level of homeownership that is just basically unheard of anywhere else in the world. It created a foundation of stability for the entire society.
This bold thinking went way beyond housing. Take the economy. While most other newly independent nations were putting up trade barriers and trying to be self-sufficient, Singapore did the exact opposite. They threw their doors wide open. They offered low taxes, guaranteed zero corruption, and stable laws to attract huge foreign companies. Their whole goal was to become the one indispensable hub for global business in Asia. The logic behind all of this was incredibly simple. As Lee Kuan Yew said, if we have no natural resources, then our people are the resource. So they poured a fortune into education. And, in a move that was pretty controversial at the time, they made English the official language for business and school, all to create a highly skilled workforce that the rest of the world wanted to hire.
So finally, how do you protect all of this hard-earned progress? Well, they came up with a really unique defense idea. The goal was to become a poisonous swallow. You know, too small to be a threat to anyone, but so difficult and painful to attack that no larger predator would ever think it was worth the trouble. They achieved this with mandatory military service for all men and by building one of the most high-tech armed forces in the entire region.
But, and this is a really big but,
This incredible, world-changing progress came with a major trade-off. It's often called the Singaporean bargain. And the deal was this: to get all of this safety and prosperity, citizens had to give up some of their individual freedoms for the good of the whole country. And this right here is the core of that bargain. It's a fundamental choice. Do you prioritize the good of the collective or the freedom of the individual? Do you value social harmony more than absolute freedom of speech? Order and stability over messy political opposition? Lee Kuan Yew firmly believed that for a fragile new nation like theirs, order and harmony had to come first.
Now, this philosophy wasn't just an idea. It translates into some very real and very strict rules. You've probably heard about the chewing gum ban, right? But it goes way deeper. We're talking heavy fines for littering, caning as a punishment for vandalism, tight government control over newspapers and TV, and a political system where opposition parties have a very hard time gaining any traction.
And this was Lee Kuan Yew's justification for it all. He basically argued, hey, what good is having total freedom of speech if your country is collapsing into chaos? If you give people a choice between a Western-style democracy and a failing state, or a prosperity and order with fewer freedoms, he was convinced most people would choose prosperity every single time.
So whether you agree with that bargain or not, and a lot of people don't, you simply cannot argue with the results. What Singapore managed to do is something no other country in modern history has ever done. It made the leap from the so-called third world to the first world in a single generation.
Just look at how fast this happened. In 1965, the average income was about $500. By the 70s, the economy was just exploding with double-digit growth year after year. By the 90s, get this, the average Singaporean was wealthier than the average citizen of Great Britain, their former colonial ruler. It wasn't a gradual climb, it was an economic sprint.
And this one number really says it all. Today, Singapore's GDP per capita is over 82,000 US dollars. That is higher than the United States, higher than Canada, higher than just about every major country on Earth. To go from that tearful press conference in 1965 to this, it's just incredible.
But the story definitely isn't over. The very success that Singapore created has now led to a whole new set of complex challenges. They have a rapidly aging population and one of the lowest birth rates in the world. The cost of living is now incredibly high. And you have to wonder, how do you maintain that level of social control in the age of the internet and social media?
Which really leaves us with this final, massive question. The entire Singaporean model was a brilliant, pragmatic, and yes, sometimes ruthless answer to a crisis of survival. But now that it has succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, what is the answer to its success? That is the billion-dollar question for Singapore's next generation.